That was a wonderful report, by the way.
We love you, Doris.
Yeah. Yes. So, cruise to Alaska. Doesn't that phrase carry a mystique among both people?
Yeah.
Cruise to Alaska. It connotes a long journey up the Inside Passage towards glaciers and bears and totems and wilderness. But many of us boating from here, Bellingham, Seattle, that are heading to Alaska may not know that they're passing through a wild and wonderful place. The northern and the central and northern BC coast, the Great Bear Rainforest. And just out of curiosity, who of you have heard of this name, this place? Nice. So 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 of you. Let's tonight just look more at this area and talk about it. And it might be that you find that it too carries a mystique that will make you really want to spend time there. So let's basically think we're going to do a cruise heading north and talk about some of the special places that we'll encounter as we head north, and then focus a bit more on the nature of in the Great Bear Rainforest, the ecosystems, the wildlife, the conservation history, which is pretty interesting, and then some of the challenges that the area faces now. And as Andreas said, Nora and I went to Southeast Alaska this year, and so I'd like to draw some comparisons between the two places, and I'll close with that. Sound good?
Yep.
So just a word about who we are. Many of you know Nora. She's actually at her home in Bozeman, Montana now. She was a public school librarian for many years in rural schools in Montana. Retired from that 2 years ago, but teaches online library science classes through the university. So the Starlink has made her life a lot easier when we're cruising than it would have been otherwise. And then, as Andreas said, I'm an ecologist at MSU, Montana State University, and I actually study how to keep big wild places healthy under the increasing human pressures that tend to get generated and under climate change. So that all fits well with being interested in the Great Bear Rainforest. And as Andreas said, we've been several times, 7 times in this southern part of the BC coastal area, and 3 times further north en route to Haida Gwaii and this year up to Southeast Alaska. Just so you know a little bit about our cruising background. And then we've done it first on our Tartan 35 Surku, and then in the last couple of years on Sea Escape. So that's who we are and where we've cruised and what boats we've been on. Now let's start our cruise here tonight.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Oh yeah,
Thank you.
hard to hear. Okay, thank you. So if we leave from Bellingham, of course we're going to go up through the Strait of Georgia, and many of us go to Desolation Sound. You can see that the water more or less ends once you get north of Desolation Sound. It's filled with mainland and islands, the Narrows, and one of the main way that folks get through this area is along this dotted line, Johnstone Strait. It can be calm and beautiful, but it can also be the worst water all the way to Alaska. And that's largely because it's a north-south wind tunnel where things can blow hard, and the current runs about 6 knots through there on average. So, wind against current, big time. Last year when we were in the area, we had an unfortunate 30-knot following wind, which we would like normally, right? But it was against a 5-knot current, and standing waves were gigantic, and as best we could muster between sail and flat-out engine was 1.5 knots over ground. And when you got 50 miles to go,
Wow.
you start to worry about that situation, right? So it's something you want to avoid if you can. The other way is to take a more protected route most of the way up through Johnstone. That involves just timing well, traveling through these 5 rapids, hitting them at slack or close to slack. And it's a really beautiful route. You've got to do a lot of route finding, and you got to do know your tide tables really well. You can sometimes do it all in one day if the gods align, but typically you stop along the way. For example, here at Shoal Bay, where cold beer is mandatory. So you're happy to stop there after getting through the rapids. So north of Johnstone Strait, the beautiful island world expresses itself just like in the San Juans. You have the Broughton Islands, which really is a peaceful paradise much of the time. So just for reference, you probably know where in northern Vancouver Island we've got Port McNeill and then Port Hardy. Those are the 2 major cities in that area. The Broughtons pretty much include all the islands that ring this Queen Charlotte Strait area over to the mainland. Two of the communities actually in the islands that we really like are Alert Bay and Soyantula. So Alert Bay is a community of about 6,000 people, 5,000, and half of them are Indigenous. It was a major village site in traditional times, and the community now is really thriving on the bridge between traditional ways and modern ways. They have a phenomenal museum, and artisans are flourishing there. It's a wonderful place to visit, and people are very welcoming. And then Soyantula is not native. It was a commune started by people from Finland, so it's largely European dominated. There's about 150 people on the island. It has just a gem of a harbor. The main town is over here, and here's the harbor, and then of course you ride your bicycle along the pathway and talk to everybody you meet along the way. I'm sorry, I'm right in your way.
No, you're good. You're good. I'm going around you. You're fine.
They have the only haul-out within 70, 80 miles, and it's this really funky 120-year-old railroad track system by which they bring boats up on the front. It's busy, it's functioning, and it's busy. There's also, of course, great anchorages in the Broughtons. One, for example, is Blunden Harbor, this area, and it's 15 miles or so across Queen Charlotte Strait from Soyantula, and so you tend to come in here to enter it. And then we like to anchor right over here, and that's just off this Midden Beach. That was the village site. This was a photograph taken in the 1880s or so. And then Emily Carr, who you might know is a famous British Columbian artist. She did this painting in 1930 or so, based on this photograph. So you'll see this in the museums in Victoria or Vancouver. But is this just amazing artwork to really think about those societies and how advanced they were? Is impressive. Another close by village site is this one on Village Island. It was the site of the last potluck. The Canadian government, of course, you know, banned potlucks in 1920s. They busted this one, Canadian police. Basically stole all the artwork from the village, and it ended up in those museums in Victoria and Vancouver. But fortunately, in the last 20 years, almost all of it has been brought back, and it's all in that museum in Alert Bay, so there is some justice. But it's just a magical place, so still today, so this is Nora standing under the original house frame. And then, if you really dig around down in the salmon berries in Salau, you can find totems laying on the ground. This was a wolf totem. Just magical. Also, there are great old-timey marinas in this area. So Lagoon Cove is one. It has just one dock, and it's got this great boathouse that's about more than 100 years old that is now a workshop. Really friendly staff. It's a wonderful place to visit. Another is near Echo Bay in the Broughtons, where the site of Billy Proctor's museum is. So he was born in this area, and as a young person was a hand logger and fisherman, and did whatever he had to do to get his family scraping by. And then in later years, he saw the forest disappearing and the fish disappearing, and he became a leading conservationist. This is all chronicled in his book, Heart of the Raincoast. You can go tie up at his dock and go walk up to the museum, and he'll give you a tour of the museum. Okay, so we continue north from Vancouver Island. It's about a 40-mile crossing of Queen Charlotte Strait, open ocean, and fortunately, like Wagoneer's Guide has really good tips on the go, no-go indicators and where to get that information. So we have a real ability these days to kind of pick our weather for trips like that. Once you get north and into this part of the Inside Passage, it's another world in terms of remoteness. Very few boats, few towns and settlements, not many fuel stations, and at the same time, really rewarding and interesting. The first anchorage that you come to is one of the best, Fury Cove. So you have to take a circuitous route around to get in to this anchorage that's basically protected for 360 degrees around you, around the boat. And it's surrounded by these middens from an indigenous village. They're like 20 feet high. This was a place that a lot of people ate a lot of clams and oysters and mussels over the millennia. Continuing north, this is now called Fitzhugh Sound. That is the Inside Passage. And surprisingly, in this remote area, there's a world-class research institute for marine science, the Hawkeye Institute. They have about 50 scientists that are based there. They do really a large amount of research. They allow you, however, to bring your dinghy up to their dock, and they work with the British Columbian Parks Department to maintain trails across the isthmus to these beaches. So these are perhaps the best beaches in the whole northwest coast, south of Glacier Bay, maybe. They're Nora's favorite, so we can never pass this area without her demanding that we stop and get out to those. So this Fitzhugh Sound area 120 years ago had a lot of people living in it. European settlers, fisher folk, etc. Today, however, they're largely all gone. So this is what was a very large fish cannery, Namu, that's entirely abandoned today. This is Ocean Falls, where a large paper mill was. There were 33,000 people living there in the late 70s. When we got there about 8 years ago, there were 5 residents. However, although the whole town, it looks like a post-apocalyptic, whatever, community, but there's this really funky set of floating docks that's a marina that is a real popular place for cruisers. So you meet all kinds of people on those docks. On the other hand, the indigenous communities, many of which are really thriving. This is Bella Bella, just north of here, that is doing really well. Well enough that they actually acquired Shearwater Marina. That's a large modern marina, the most so in this whole part of the BC coast. And the natives are running it really, really well. So it's a very popular stopover, even for the big boats. They have a haul out here, and it's not a train track, it's a real deal haul out. It's the only one in a 370-mile stretch of coast north-south. So this is a place you want to know about if your shaft gets bent or when you hit a log or something. So if we kind of head west from the Inside Passage and go to the outer coast, this is what you find: a network of islands and rocky outcroppings that are just battered by the Pacific swells and the wind. And it's just full of life as a consequence of that. We spent 3 weeks in this area 2 years ago. We saw no other pleasure boats in 3 weeks here. Very different from the Inside Passage where you see some. We did our best to try to sail whenever we could, and that included against wind and current. And we found it was pretty easy to be in conditions where our bow was buried in green water, and the motion was almost unimaginable for us. And at times like that, this is the only position Nora could get in down below where she could steady herself. She made a nest on the sole of the boat, braced between the settees, with her blankets and books, and sometimes she'd be there for 8 hours. I'd have to open the hatch and yell down, "Are you still there?" The cats were generally, unlike here, plugged right up against her side because they were so terrified. Well, now that we're well up the coast, let's talk a little bit about the Great Bear Rainforest itself. So that last photograph was from out here, Aristobel Island. So the Great Bear Rainforest is really globally significant. It basically contains about 15% of the intact temperate rainforest globally. It's got some 1,000 uninhabited islands and something in the order of 2,000 river valleys that have wild salmon, all of which are intact. And that's quite in contrast to every river valley south of here, to Northern California. The southern extent of the temperate rainforest, has some roading, some damming, some fragmentation by people. From here north, It's different. It's all wild. And as we passed through there over the years, I kept saying, how can this be? Why isn't this like everywhere else to the south? And I'll explain what the answer to that here in a minute. There's only about 3,500 people here, and they're largely in those communities that I mentioned, with almost nobody living out otherwise. This book is probably the best source of information about this area, written by Ian McAllister. In addition to the text, he has really fabulous photographs, and some of them you'll see here attributed to his name. If we talk about some of the ecosystems, let's look at the outer coastal system, perhaps most extremely represented by Triangle Island. So Mike, you rounded Cape Scott. It's a pretty remote area, isn't it, on its own? This island is 30 miles still further out into the ocean, and it's just full of life. So, world's second largest breeding colony of stellar sea lions, as you see here. Elephant seals, more than 100,000 of these guys, the tufted puffins, and some 500,000 Cassin's auklets. Half the world's population are nesting on this one crazy island. Moving inland to the forested zone, this is where there are these, majestic temperate rainforests, like on the Olympic Peninsula. So you're familiar with this ecosystem type. Notable is that these forests are super productive. Some patches are not disturbed for almost 1,000 years, and so they just grow to massive diameters and heights. And when those trees die and fall, they create this incredible structure in the forest floor. And that's all critical habitat for a whole variety of species, including something like the marble murrelet that you might see 30 or 50 miles offshore feeding, just these little brown job birds. They actually fly equally that distance into the forest to nest high in old growth trees. And the chicks, gee, mom and dad, I don't know how to fly yet. They have to jump out of the tree and fall 40 feet to the ground and then walk to the coast. That's their strategy. And, they are an endangered species, maybe that's why.
What are they called?
Marble murrelets. Of course, all 5 species of Pacific salmon spawn in these rivers. And they have a big impact on the place in that, salmon are what we can call nutrient pumps. They're harvesting energy through the oceans and then coming up to the rivers and spawning in small streams. And then bears and others are foraging in them and carrying those nutrients into the uplands. The size of these forests in those riparian zones has been directly linked to that nutrient subsidy. And of course, the salmon were a key reason why those First Nations people flourished over the last 8,000 years in this area, and why modern communities are doing so well. Black bears have been abundant in this coastal area. It turns out that there are different subspecies than on the interior areas. They're called the Kermode bears or spirit bears. And we got mama, black bear, we got cub black bear, and we got this. A white black bear? What? Anybody know why? How can they be white? They're not spray painted. So they're not. It turns out it's not albinoism. It turns out this subspecies has a recessive gene for this pelage, this fur color. And about 10 to 20% of the subspecies are this white phase. And of course, nobody knows why. They play a really strong role in the traditions of the indigenous people in the region. And the Great Bear Rainforest is largely named after this subspecies. It's so special. It's the species by which the place is known. There's speculation that it could be related to success in catching salmon, with the white fur blending in with the light sky from the salmon's point of view. It sounds to me like a hypothesis that's very difficult to test. But nonetheless, it's a species that attracts a lot of attention, and we'll get to that in a minute. If you wanted to see them, there's a couple of tour guides that are working in that area, eco-tour guides that could get us into places to see them. The grizzlies have not traditionally been there, and as you go to Alaska, you probably don't really think about carrying bear spray till you get to Ketchikan or something. But it turns out these days, in the last 2 decades, the grizzlies have been moving right over to the coastal islands throughout, pretty much from almost from Campbell River north. And it's not really clear why they're expanding their distribution like that, but they are. They tend to push the black bears around pretty considerably, so they're having a big impact. The wolves here are a coastal subspecies, different than the interior, like the brown bear, like the black bears. And they mostly feed on deer, but amazingly, they feed on a lot of sea life. So this one is harvesting herring eggs off the kelp. Wolves doing that. And it turns out that they will swim 5 to 10 kilometers offshore to rocky islands where seals and sea lions are hauling out to prey on those species. So this is a sea lion carcass being consumed by these wolves. Again, pictures by the author of that book. Just remarkable, right? Just unthinkable. If I can't get my 40-foot sailboat to those little islands, how are these guys getting there? And then there's a few native communities in addition to the ones that I mentioned. This one in particular, Hartley Bay, it feels unhinged from the rest of the world. It's just surrounded by mountains and forest and sea. It has no roads. It has no airport. The only connection to the outside world is a ferry that comes once a week from Prince Rupert. At the same time, it has no businesses, no stores, no businesses other than the fuel dock at the marina, and a couple of eco tour guides live there. So no commerce basically. Without cars and roads, how do you get between houses? Well, they have this cool boardwalk network that they use for walking, but also for driving their golf carts. They really are blending traditional ways with modern ways, and from young folks to old folks, they're doing really well. And at the same time, you know, people like us and our big fancy boats are totally welcome there. If you walk these streets, every person is saying hello, stopping and talking. The way life ought to be, right? Okay, well, how did it get to be like this? Particularly since in the early 1990s, this was called the Mid-Coast Timber Supply Area. timber supply area. That says a lot about the intentions of those in charge at the time. Well, just when old growth forest conservation was getting attention here in the Washington coastal area, it also was in Clayoquot Sound on the outside of Vancouver Island, which is where Andreas had just been a couple days ago. There was a large-scale campaign to stop logging in those forests that the natives had thousands of years of interaction with. And a so-called resulting War of the Woods blew it all up to the whole British Columbian coast with massive demonstrations. In 2006, there was a package announced for conservation of the forests and improved logging practice and particularly improved governance, more central role of Native Americans in governance. It wasn't until 2006 that agreement was reached, and that's why those of you that haven't heard of the Great Bear Rainforest, it's only been named for 8 years. So this vast wilderness that I described is unspoiled because these people came to this agreement and are protecting it. So those protections include these hatched areas are basically complete conservation reserves. No logging, no roading. They cover 85% of the forest. So if you know anything about the U.S. Forest Service or the state DNR, they might set aside 5% as protected area, not 85. And then the 15% that's remaining can only be logged under ecological forestry approaches, and those are designed to have a really soft touch on the land and sustain the forests and the wildlife. And that's done, of course, to help strengthen those indigenous communities. And in total, some 70% of the old growth forest here is protected. You know, I had no idea that this was happening. We'd go through this area and think, this is just too great to be true, and it's for a reason. People did this. They not only did it on land, they did it for the whole marine area outlined here, including even west of Haida Gwaii, all the way down to Vancouver Island. This Marine Plan Partnership for the North Pacific Coast. So it too is managed through an ecological based management approach that puts human well-being as a high priority, ecological integrity, and equitable governance. And if you take the area of this marine zone and the Great Bear Rainforest terrestrial part, it's the longest area, the largest area in the world that's under ecosystem-based management. This is what we just pass by when we're trying to get to Ketchikan. Okay, there's one really serious challenge right now, and that's this coastal gas link pipeline. It's meant to extend from Dawson in interior BC across the Rockies and across the Coast Range to Kitimat. Hartley Bay is right in here, so that's kind of the neighborhood this runs through. The indigenous folks along the route have really been divided. Some really wanting the pipeline for the jobs, but others really resisting and protesting for over a 10-year period because of wanting to protect the nature and their traditional ways. An agreement was signed in 2022. The builders jumped on it and they completed it just a year ago, basically. It's not yet functioning, but when it does open, there's some 360 tankers doing round trips per year that's associated with the project. They'll be delivering this liquefied natural gas to Asia. And, unlike carrying oil, that liquefied natural gas is not going to cause a huge slick if a ship hits a rock. But there's real threat of fire and explosion that people at Hartley Bay are really concerned about. And then the other thing is it can be hard on the whales. So there's some, almost 600 whales that winter, humpback and fin whales that winter in this area. And researchers have projected that about 20 of those could be killed each year by ship strikes. This is just a picture of a whale that's got pop marks on its back or something like that. And then the people at Hartley Bay, they're not sure they want the modern world sending 300 a ship a day to and from by their village. On the other hand, there's really great future, promising future, yeah. So sustainable conservation has really been flourishing in the last 10 years. This is an eco-tourist lodge in Clem 2, just north of Bella Bella. This is where you can go to see the spirit bear. And that's true in some of these other communities. Again, it's really heartening to see the native cultures coming into the modern world with things going so well for them. Okay, let's wrap up by thinking about, well, how does this BC area compare to Southeast Alaska? Turns out Nora and I lived in Southeast Alaska and left in 1983, 41 years ago. We haven't been back since until this summer. And I was really curious as to how it had changed over that time and how it compared to the BC coast that we knew so well. And as we traveled north through there up to Juneau and Hoona, we got some answers. We found that the wildlife are just thriving. That there's about 3 times more bald eagles there than in the 1960s. That sea otters were reintroduced in the mid-60s. There's now 25,000. Humpback whales in Glacier Bay have been on a steady increase. Grizzly bears are doing well. Wolves are doing well. The saltwater fishery has been also either steady, it was always good, but steady or even expanding. And of course, that's great for the commercial fishermen. These are purse seiners off Baranof Island. There's 4 just in this picture. There were probably 20 up and down the coast. These are local commercial fishermen in Petersburg with halibut. They're catching halibut like crazy. And this fishery is not only good for the commercial people, but for you and I. If you had heard much about Southeast Alaska, you'd know it was the clear-cutting capital of the universe. There had been a 50-year timber contract in place that led to this massive clear-cutting. That ended in the mid-90s, and basically now, to my shock, there is no clear-cutting at all. There's almost no forest harvest. And the forests grow so quickly that cutover areas recover. So as you travel north, it looks like the Great Bear Rainforest, just endless, beautiful forest. So this is our abode in a river delta with what you typically see anywhere you anchor in that area. One thing that Alaska has over BC are these tidal glaciers that are accessible. This is the LeConte Glacier near Petersburg. The seals breed on these ice flows because the predators can't get out, and so there are seal pups all over the place. And the native communities are doing really well, as in BC. Nora Nora actually had her first teaching job in Klukwan. That's up the road from Haines, Alaska. It was pretty. It was really at the bottom 40 years ago, and now they have this fantastic museum, and the community is really recovering language, arts, knowledge, and this is true for many places in that area. Another a downside, perhaps, an impact, are the cruise ships. So Ketchikan can have 2 to 6 cruise ships on any given day for like 4 months of the year. That's 12,000 plus visitors coming out into the downtown, and it's true for Juneau, for Sitka, for Skagway. And I won't go into the details, but the locals alerted us to the large number of impacts that has. The other thing is not that perhaps is not a great attribute that's not human caused, is like the weather. So Bellingham, summer dry, right? Winter wet, summer dry. Today's an example. BC coast, summer dry. You cross that Alaska border, winter wet, summer wet. And I mean wet. So we were 2 weeks in Juneau, and we had 12 days of continuous rain, typically 1 or 2 inches a day. And you know how much that is. So our amazing dry boat that's insulated and no leaks, it was just sweating water on the inside, mildew. We found our very best rain gear was not up to the task. So to close this out, I think you'll agree, based on on our trip north, that this Great Bear Rainforest is really something. That the forests are natural and manage to stay that way. The wildlife is doing well. The fisheries improving. Indigenous people are doing well. And Southeast Alaska is really great too, maybe except for the cruise ships and the weather. So cruising and summer dry is hard to beat compared to summer wet. But this whole stretch, this 1,000 miles from here to the north end of the Inside Passage, is just an unbelievably vast coastal wilderness where, and I thought about this every day, all those endless hours of doing this trip, where nature and people are happy. So where in the planet is that true? If you really think about it. And so it does your heart and soul good to know that these kind of places exist, and that we can have some time in them. So with that, you've been a wonderful audience, very attentive. Thank you. And again, remember, I'm not the treasurer. I'm not responsible for membership, so be kind. Thank you.